This is Nasha Kasha, Ukrainian Almanac. 28 minutes of stories for everyone about Ukrainian life. Nasha Kasha is heard on 16 campus and community radio stations, from Newfoundland to British Columbia. Vitayu! My name is Stefan Andrusiak, and this is episode 173. Vernon. Population just over 40,000. Vernon is a city in the Okanagan region of the southern interior of British Columbia, 440 kilometers northeast of Vancouver. World-renowned golf courses, agritourism, hiking and biking trails, and outdoor adventure. The area is known for its long, warm summers and mild winter climate. What few travelers realize as they flock to this vacation land is that many of the highways carved out of the landscape were cleared and graded by forced laborers who had been sentenced not for what they committed, but for who they were. To find out more, I've come to an acreage on the outskirts of Vernon to meet with two women, each from a very different background, each working to discover and to preserve the memory of those internees.
My GPS took me up the hill. Hi, I'm Stefan.
Hi, Stefan.
Yeah.
Well, it's the California of Canada. People don't realize there's a desert just far away from here, but you can grow. That's a fig tree, and I don't take it out in the winter. There'll be figs. If you go just down the street, the guy has huge ones, and you can buy fresh figs and cantaloupe and kiwis.
Don't forget to turn off the water.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Stefan.
Lorna.
Lorna, nice to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Let's go around backwards. Somewhat cooler and under a little shady
Sure,
part.
great.
I'm Lorna Myers from Vernon, British Columbia. I have one younger sister who lives here in Vernon, too. My mother's family is Doukhobor, so they came to Canada in 1899, into British Columbia in 1910. My dad's family is American. One set of his grandparents is from the no longer country of Bessarabia, called Germans from Russia. They came to the States and then came up to Canada in 1910. And the other branch lived in America for many, many years and came up from Oklahoma into Canada, crossing at the Peace Arch border crossing in around 1910 and settled in Vernon in 1910. The Doukhobors, it's a religious sect. Basically, they're Russian Orthodox that started having questions about the icon worshipping in Doukhobor religion, and the Tsar, the bishop or something like this, called them Doukhobortsi, which means spirit wrestler. He meant it as a derogatory term, but they took it to mean something that they question, and they believe they're pacifists. Because they refused to raise arms, they were kind of essentially kicked out of Russia in 1899 and came to Canada.
In friendship, love, and freedom's banner.
There was a burning of the arms in 1895, and shortly after that, they decided that they didn't want the Doukhobors in Russia anymore, so they wanted to kick them out. So they sent people to Canada to look into things, and they moved to Saskatchewan.
And in Saskatchewan, were they well received, or was it a turbulent welcome?
Initially, it was well received. They set up communal living villages throughout most of eastern Saskatchewan, around the Kamsack area, Yorkton area, and north of that.
Neath our banner, peace and friendship, love and freedom ever.
They lived like that until 1905, when the Minister of Interior decided that they couldn't own communal lands any longer. The Doukhobors kind of split into two factions. One was the independent Doukhobors, who took out individual homesteads in Saskatchewan, and the other branch, or the communal Doukhobors, so to speak, our community, and they came to British Columbia, where they set up their villages in the Kootenays area.
Why did Saskatchewan not want communal ownership of land?
They didn't fit into what the kind of model, I guess, of what Saskatchewan wanted at the time, and so they said no more. I didn't grow up in a Doukhobor community, but I spent quite a bit of time there with my grandparents, and in recent years, I was more into my family history, and so I started doing some research into them, and started looking for my great-grandparents, and discovered that I had they're all in the same cemetery, but one set had grave markers and the other set didn't. So that kind of started me doing research into cemeteries and making up lists of people who were buried in the cemeteries without any markers. And I actually wound up visiting every Doukhobor cemetery in British Columbia and doing research on them, took pictures of all their markers, so forth, and have been working on that for probably about 15 years now.
Was there a time when you were a child that you said, this is really a passion of mine? Can you point to a moment that influenced you in this way?
Not so much as a child. When I was 21, both my maternal grandmother and my father passed away within 9 months of each other, and that's when I started becoming very interested in my family history and then just in history in general.
What did you study and what career path did you take?
I have a Bachelor of Science in Food Science and Microbiology, so I work with the federal government. Not so much in the food aspect of it. I went into animal health, and now I coordinate massive piles of data for animal disease surveillance.
And what is it like living in this part of the country and working in that field? What is it that would distinguish itself from the kind of work your colleagues would do in other parts of British Columbia?
Actually, my job is based in Ottawa. I was living here when they offered me the job, so I said, I'll take it as long as I can stay here. And so they allowed me to do that. Now it's quite easy to be on teleconferences, video conferences with people, so it's not that hard. I just love it here because my family's been here since 1910.
Doukhobor roots, on your mother's side, the Doukhobor roots, but on your father's side, American. Mm-hmm. How did you become interested in the internment? Were the Doukhobors among the groups that were interned during the First World War?
No, they weren't. How I became interested in internment is I've known about it since I was a child, because in the Monashee area, I grew up in Cherryville, and in the Monashee area there was an internment camp that was quite close to where my great-grandparents first homesteaded. And so every time we would drive by that, my dad would say, hey, there was an internment camp there. A number of years ago, I met Andrea Malish, and we were talking about it, and I said, well, I know where the Monashee internment camp is. I grew up in the area, and I know where it is. And I think at that time, my family was the only people who knew where it was. About 5 years ago, I was working on a project photographing war graves, and they sent me a list of all the war graves in Vernon, and amongst those were the names of 7 internees. And when I went out and I took the photographs, there was one person's marker that was pretty much destroyed. It was a white marble cross marker, and it had been pretty much over the years fallen apart, and there were just pieces of it. I knew his name was Stefan Sapina, and so I contacted Andrea about, can we get a new marker for this guy? We wound up getting new markers for all 7 of the guys who are buried in Vernon Cemetery, and there's actually now a monument in place for them as well. And from there, that started a project of locating all of the people who died in the internment camps in Canada across the country, and getting markers for all of them and making sure that they're properly memorialized.
Those initial markers, was that your initiative on your own or through some organization?
No, I was just photographing the graves, and so then when I contacted Andrea, that became the initiative to get the new markers, and we put a grant in through the Vernon and District Family History Society, and we got all the markers for them through that.
I don't know where Monashee is.
Monashee is about 50 miles east of here. It's between Vernon and Edgewood. And so they had the internees up on that highway to put the highway through from Vernon to Edgewood. Present day Highway 6. There was the group of the Monashee that started moving east. And then later there was a group in Edgewood that began moving west to make the road through there.
Where to from here?
I'm working on another project right now, trying to identify all the names of the men, women, and children who are interned.
Can you just give me some sense of the magnitude of that human capture that took place during the First World War?
It's no secret that British Columbia had the most internment camps in Canada. There was a camp at Nanaimo on the island, and in the interior there was one at Vernon, one at Monashee, Mara, which is north of here, Otter, which is around the field area, Revelstoke. There was a camp at Edgewood, and there was a camp at Fernie and a camp at Morrissey, just outside of Edgewood.
And why do you think there were more than anywhere else, particularly here?
The provincial government had a road building initiative and land clearing initiative that they wanted to help doing. So it was cheaper labor and available labor. So they took advantage of it. Not many people know, but my great-grandfather, because he homesteaded near the internment camp, he was actually supplied all the commissary for the Monashee internment camp.
So he was the supplier of it? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I think Vernon is an amazing place to live. I was born here and have lived here or in the area most of my life. Wouldn't trade it for anything. The other thing with Vernon, it's also home to one of the largest internment camps in World War I. At least one of the longest running camps, or probably the largest running camp in Canadian history.
And what is left of that structure or of that site?
There's nothing left of it. The structure that was there in World War I was built in 1902. It was originally a jail. They decided to move the provincial jail to Kamloops, and so they moved the prisoners out of there, and it became a sane asylum. And so they moved up people from New Westminster for about 10 or 11 years. They then built a large facility called Essendale, and moved them down there. So in 1914, there was this big building sitting there empty, and it was taken over by federal operations for the internment, and stayed like that until 1920 when it finally closed.
I was in Quebec, northern Quebec at Spirit Lake and the site of the internment camp there. There, it was the men only that were surrounded, guarded. Women and children were a little bit further off in a little town or a village, and they had access to a grocery store and whatnot. But here, it was the entire, am I right, the entire family that was put into a jail situation. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that's correct. They had different facilities. So there's the first class and what they call the first class prisoners and the second class prisoners. So first class prisoners were typically the German prisoners. They a number of them had their wives and children, and they were given. Eventually, they were built little houses on the grounds, and that's where they lived with their families. A lot of them, the second class, were the Austro-Hungarians, and those are the ones who were, sent to the work camps to work on the roads, whereas the Germans with the first class status were essentially left just in the main camps.
A pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Nasha Kasha comes to you from CHRW 94.9 FM on the campus of Western University in London, Ontario, Canada. We're heard on CHMR 93.5 FM in St. John's, Newfoundland, on CKDU 88.1 FM in Halifax, on local 107.3 FM in St. John, New Brunswick, on CJAS Radio 93.5 FM in Saint Augustine, Quebec, on CJLO 1690 AM in Montreal, on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, on CFMU 93.3 FM in Hamilton, on CKMS 102.7 FM in Kitchener-Waterloo, on CJAM 99.1 FM in Windsor and Detroit, on CKLU 96.7 FM in Sudbury, on CILU 102.7 FM in Thunder Bay, on 101.5 UMFM in Winnipeg, on CFMQ 98.1 FM in Hudson Bay, Saskatchewan, on CFBX 92.5 FM in Kamloops, and on CIVL 101.7 FM in Abbotsford, British Columbia.
I'm Michelle Lockery. I'm an artist and a muralist that lives in Vernon, British Columbia. My medium is large-scale murals, but they're done in a way of a story collecting. So mine are a tool. So we hire at-risk youth and we involve the community because I believe the community has a story to tell. At-risk kids come with colorful, dark bunny hugs and hoods. They look scary. They're not. I see them as a bunch of parakeets with potential, right? But they don't get in the boxes that we're saying, well, why aren't you going here? There is a support. There is no support for kids that aren't connected to the education or medical system. There's no support. So when we started doing this in 1999, I would send the kids places and they'd come back and say, well, they won't let us in the office. I'd say, what are you talking about? They won't let you in the office. So the kids, we started making them a uniform that said Mural Project. So I was in the town of Merritt, BC, same thing with predominantly First Nations kids. So once they got a uniform, they felt that the Mural Project gave them the pass for people to trust them. And what would happen is the kids would then never take those uniforms off. I still see kids today that are in their 40s that were on my crew, and I've had thousands of kids in my education program that wear their sweatshirts because they said they get treated better.
You called them parakeets because they wore colorful clothes and were loud?
Because they are just bright lights like parakeets. Parakeets bring joy. My grandma always had a parakeet, always named Ricky. It was always bright green. And she said it's because every morning you got greeted with joy. And I think at-risk kids have pure joy.
Tell me about your forebears and how they came to this country, this part of this land.
So my family, the small town of Michel Natal, British Columbia, where I was born and raised, was an immigrant community. So it's a border town. So there's Michel Natal, Middletown. It's where the 5 coal mines have been since the early 1900s. My father was of Czech background. My mother is of Ukraine background. They were called by the government to come and buy land. So come and buy land, promised land, come and buy this acreage. So they came, bought the acreage. My family from Ukraine came, paid, $25,000 for this acreage and had 3 years to clear it. And if they didn't clear it, they had to give it back. Well, my grandfather and my uncle were put into an internment camp, so they couldn't clear the land. We have the diaries that talk about that. So they lost the land. So they had to leave. So my great-grandmother had to leave with my uncle Stephen, and because my grandfather could no longer work, because when he returned from the camps, he was ill. So that's kind of how it happened. And so they moved to the Crow's Nest Pass in Alberta, which is 20 miles away from this little town of Michel Natal. And so my father and mother met, and so we have the Ukraine side, the Czech side, and all of those people in a little town of 3,000 people that have built the infrastructure of British Columbia through coal mining, and that is where I was raised, and that is where my whole life has been defined by that little town. There was a huge class distinction, and when you talk about the classes, I remember stories that there was Little Italy, and so half of my family's from Italy. There was the Ukraine side, there was the German side, and people did not talk. There's a funny, terrible kind of fable that my father said that when my grandfather and grandmother got married, that my grandfather's Czech family told my grandfather he couldn't marry my Scottish grandmother because all their children would look like monkeys. And that's how bad it was in that era. And yet the town was hard. They were immigrant people. They built schools. They had an opera house, bakeries. It was one of the major little towns in British Columbia.
If he told him that someone defied someone.
My grandfather and grandmother did. He was 35, she was 19. On my Ukrainian side, my father, swept my mother off her feet. She was living in a harsh, my grandparents were harsh on the Ukraine side. I didn't know why. I loved my Baba and my Guido. My Guido ran the Alberta Union. He supported all the union men and started the union in Alberta to feed the coal miners because they were starving. And it was a harsh upbringing. There was music and fiddles and mandolins and Ukrainian men and vodka, but it was harsh. There was rules. My mother, they were starving. My mom tells stories of killing a moose to survive. But I remember white linen tablecloths in my Scottish grandmother's house. I remember making pierogies with my Baba. It was clean and we were well fed and looked after. At my shower, I had 300 women show up to set you up in a house. So to me, it was true community. That's how I was raised, with all these immigrants trying to work together. It was an underground mine, and it was filthy. At one point, they wanted to move, and they put a new mine in. So the government come in a forced relocation, and with bulldozers, put X's and O's on the houses of these immigrants that have built those houses on their own dime and their own hands, and forcibly relocated the town 3 miles down the road to the new town, interesting enough, which was purchased by the mayor at the time, that land. So it's a very controversial story. And it was devastating. And so I started working in this art council and heritage council, and all these mysteries came, and I was fascinated. So I thought, well, I'll put it on a mural. And that mural brought so much emotion when you could put what was taken back and the coming together of that in that moment defied me. I'm a self-taught artist, and I have traveled the world telling community stories through the medium of muraling.
You bring people together to participate in the creation of the murals for healing, as I understand it, but I sense that they also provide healing for you.
Oh, it is, right? So you surround yourself with people because art levels everybody. There's such a class issue still in Canada today. People think we're not a racist country. I don't believe that. I think we are. I really do. And so you take people that are considered at risk. I believe communities are at risk. And I think that there's shame that has been left from our ancestors of what has happened. I didn't understand why. I could hear my father. I saw the brilliance of their talents, but they had shame, and I didn't know why. So the murals, when you bring people together, when you're painting, it's like everybody puts their hard shell away and they come together and we're just all the same person. Whether you're government, mayor, at risk, homeless, you're equal in front of a giant wall.
I can't see the mural, nor can our listeners. Can you describe one of them?
There is one that we call the Sunflower Wall, Sunflower Mural, which is in Vernon, British Columbia, which is a story of internment. It stands on the main street of Vernon, downtown. I love research. I had all my kids in the museum, and I found a letter. And that letter had the name of John Seneshin on it. Now, my family name is Seneshin. It's not a common name. And I had always heard a story that my grandfather had a long-lost brother that he had spent his whole life looking for. And my grandmother had always sort of said to him, "You've lost the farm, you drank." There was all these horrible stories. Well, I'm looking at this letter from my grandfather saying, "I'm looking for my brother Stephen." He was last seen in the Vernon area, and the letter returned to him was from the taxidermist at the time, and I believe it was 1921, saying he was in a work camp in the Lumbee-Monashee area. I was like, okay, this is weird, right? It was like, so I phoned my mom right away. And then at the time, I had also painted a small Ukrainian mural at a school here with a woman named Lois that I did not know was Andrea Malish's sister. Long story short, I discovered that my family was not who they said they were. And so when my father passed away, we went through the trunks, and I found my grandfather's UK passport. He's not from the UK. None of the papers added up. And so once we started to dig into the trunks, we were like, this story is not true. So I'm very grateful to have met Andrea Malish. And so then together we painted this mural, and that mural represents that story of the woman that came from Ukraine, with hope, the man who came, who wanted to work and couldn't and was imprisoned, the sunflower, which represents Ukraine, but it represents peace, and, the flower of Ukraine, and barbed wire, because nobody knew. I did not know, and my grandfather, and I get very emotional about this, the shame my grandfather felt. He did not lose the property. It was taken from him, but he went to his grave not knowing and not letting his grandchildren know that he was not at fault. And the most beautiful part of that mural is at the end when we opened it, First Nations came and they welcomed, because there was never a welcome. So the chief, Byron Lewis, welcomed, and he said, "I welcome the people. I welcome European settlers to this country." And we had a salt and bread exchange, and there was the priests and all of the people that would be involved. And I have this photo, and it's just absolutely profound, the healing power of that mural. I have a brother and a sister. My cousin's name is Mike Sanishin or Seneshin, and born in Alberta but now lives in BC on the island, and is a professional musician, and he learned from my grandfather.
So tell me about your studio.
I would like to tell you that it's grand with great big huge windows and lights, but it's not. It's an old carport, and I'm grateful for it. And we have wax on one side and paint on the other, and we paint with beeswax in the traditional Ukrainian way, except we've just modernized it. And beeswax preserves, and it's healing. And we take oil paints and beeswax, and we have conversations, and then we torch, and then the healing process happens.
When you talk about beeswax, I think about Easter eggs.
It is like the Easter eggs, except that takes fine motor skills that I don't have, because my hands are much more of a gnarly, and so this was I guess my murals are giant Easter eggs. That's the torch that you use to melt this, and you just light it on fire.
Here in your garage?
Yeah, watch, I'll show you. Are you ready? Just the wax. Isn't that wonderful? And you just melt it.
And how do you get the color into the wax?
Well, we use oil paints or pigments. So you use, these are pigments, and you just take it and you
Or you rub it, and that's
can
what
rub
you're...
it, or you can drip it, or you can cut it out, or you can use varnishes, and then at the end of the day, you just light it on fire. And it's just adding layers and torching. I know that my grandmother had chickens. I have horses and chickens, and I don't know why. I'm a coal miner girl. I love my horses, my chickens, and the land, and harvesting the rose hips and the elderberries and the pine tar. I have laundry on the line. You don't use your dryer in the summer. You put laundry on the line, right? And these are my wonderful chickens. So the copper morans and giant jerseys with the best eggs you could possibly imagine, because you can't not have chickens. Like, that's what people have.
Кури мої кури, кури шабатури, якби мені чоловіка такої натури, якби мені чоловіка такої натури, що горілочки не пив.
The internment has defined my art.
What do you want people who view your murals to take away with them?
That we're all equal and we're all connected, and that our stories join us. It's not our economics, it's not the color of our skin. I believe that we're all one tribe.
Nasha Kasha is also a podcast. Subscribe for free wherever you find your podcasts. In the program, you heard bandurist Viktor Mishalov. The Blaine Lake, Saskatchewan Doukhobor congregation sang part of a worship service from May of 2018. Christina Solovey sang Ticha Voda, Calm Waters. Dacha Bracha with Shoz Pod Duba, Kure Kure Shabature was part of an ethnographic musicology archival project from Kosinivka, Ukraine. And Mike Senishin now with an old-time fiddle medley. Partial funding for Nasha Kasha is provided by the Shevchenko Foundation. See you in a week, God willing. До милої зустрічі. За тиждень часу, дорогі слухачі.